It is the early hours of the 22nd of June 1941, inside the Wolfschanze, the Wolf's Lair, a concrete and timber headquarters buried deep within the forests near Rastenburg in East Prussia. Mist clings to the pine trees outside. Telephone lines hum with reports arriving from the east, where 3 million German soldiers, 4,000 tanks, and thousands of aircraft have just crossed the Soviet frontier in the opening hours of Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. Inside a low, windowless room lit by a single lamp, a heavy-set man in a white coat prepares a syringe. His name is Theodor Morell, and he has been Adolf Hitler's personal physician since 1936. Hitler sits stiffly, sleeves rolled, waiting. Morell's diary entries from these months, preserved and later examined by historians, record an escalating routine of injections, glucose solutions, hormone extracts, vitamins, and stimulant compounds administered almost daily, sometimes several times within a single day. Records suggest that on this morning, as elsewhere in the war, the injection is intended simply to steady nerves and sharpen focus before a day of enormous consequence. Nobody in that room, least of all Morell himself, could have understood what this routine would eventually become, nor how deeply it would entangle itself with the military decisions that followed. Outside, church bells were not yet ringing in alarm across Europe, but within months the campaign launched that morning would grind into the depths of a Russian winter, and the man directing it from headquarters far behind the front would increasingly be a man whose physical and mental state depended, in ways historians still debate the extent of, on the contents of Theodor Morell's medical bag. This quiet, clinical moment inside a forest bunker would prove to be the beginning of a pattern that stretched across nearly 4 more years of war, one that has left an unusually well-documented trail through Morell's own meticulous records, and one that continues to raise difficult questions about how personal health, medical intervention, and catastrophic strategic decision-making became intertwined at the very center of the Nazi war machine. To understand why this routine took hold, it helps to understand the man who created it and the pressures building around him by the summer of 1941. Adolf Hitler had suffered from chronic digestive complaints, insomnia, and anxiety-related symptoms for years before the war, conditions that worsened considerably once he assumed direct responsibility for German military strategy. Morell, who joined Hitler's staff in 1936 after treating him for severe stomach cramps, built his practice around a philosophy of aggressive intervention, favoring injections over tablets and believing firmly in the restorative power of vitamin compounds, hormone extracts, and glucose solutions. Other doctors within Hitler's circle, including Karl Brandt, viewed Morell's methods with open suspicion, and several later described him in private as reckless, though Morell retained Hitler's trust precisely because his treatments produced immediate, if temporary, feelings of energy and well-being. By the time Barbarossa began, Hitler was sleeping poorly, working extraordinarily long hours, and increasingly unwilling to delegate operational decisions to his generals, a burden that grew heavier as the campaign's early successes gave way to fierce resistance and the first serious German setbacks outside Moscow that December. The scale of the strategic problem facing Hitler by late 1941 was immense. German forces had advanced hundreds of miles into Soviet territory, yet Moscow remained unconquered. Casualties were mounting into the hundreds of thousands, and the supply lines stretching back into Poland and Germany strained under the pressure of an underestimated enemy and an unforgiving winter. Existing military planning had assumed a rapid Soviet collapse within weeks. Instead, the German High Command found itself managing a war of attrition for which neither its logistics nor its leadership's temperament were well suited. It was against this backdrop of mounting strain, sleeplessness, and physical decline that Morell's treatments intensified, moving beyond vitamins and glucose toward more powerful compounds intended to combat exhaustion, digestive pain, and the crushing pressure of decisions affecting millions of lives. Morell's medical records, preserved after the war and examined extensively by later historians, including Norman Ohler, whose 2015 book, Blitzed, brought this history to wide public attention, document a steadily expanding pharmacological regimen. Early treatments centered on a compound Morell called vitamultin and a hormone preparation named prostaglandin, both administered by injection, alongside intravenous glucose intended to combat fatigue. As the war progressed and Hitler's symptoms worsened, including tremors, digestive spasms, and periods of severe exhaustion, Morell's diary entries record the introduction of stronger substances. These included Eukodal, a powerful opioid closely related to oxycodone, used at various points for pain relief, and cocaine eye drops prescribed by another physician, Erwin Giesing, following a perforated eardrum Hitler suffered in the July 1944 bomb plot at the Wolf's Lair. Morell's notes also reference the barbiturate Phanodorm, used to help Hitler sleep, and there is documented use within Morell's supply records of Pervitin, a methamphetamine-based stimulant tablet manufactured by the Berlin pharmaceutical company Temmler-Werke, the same compound issued widely to German soldiers during the 1940 invasion of France to sustain the relentless pace of the Blitzkrieg advance. Exact dosages and frequency for Hitler personally remain a matter of ongoing historical analysis, since Morell's shorthand notation was often abbreviated and inconsistent, but the surviving pattern shows injections occurring with increasing regularity as the war turned against Germany, particularly from 1943 onward. Historians continue to debate how much of this reflected genuine, escalating physical illness, including what several post-war medical analyses have suggested may have been early-stage Parkinson's disease, evidenced by a visible left-hand tremor documented by staff and captured on newsreel footage from 1944 and 1945, and how much reflected a dependency cycle in which each new treatment addressed symptoms partly created by the treatments before it. What is not disputed is that Morell administered these substances almost daily for years, that Hitler grew increasingly reliant on him personally, dismissing other physicians who questioned the regimen, and that the pharmacological routine became inseparable from Hitler's daily functioning as a wartime leader. If you're enjoying this journey through history, subscribing genuinely helps us continue bringing remarkable true stories like this to the channel. The practical consequences of this regimen became most visible during the Battle of Stalingrad, where between August 1942 and February 1943, the German Sixth Army, under General Friedrich Paulus, became encircled by Soviet forces after Hitler repeatedly refused requests to permit a breakout, insisting the city be held regardless of cost. Contemporary accounts from officers present at briefings, including later testimony from figures such as Heinz Guderian and recollections recorded by Albert Speer, describe Hitler during this period as increasingly rigid, prone to sudden explosive anger, and resistant to information that contradicted his fixed judgments, patterns consistent with both the extraordinary strain of the situation and the physiological effects of the substances he was receiving. Around 91,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner when the remnants of the Sixth Army finally surrendered, of whom only a small fraction survived Soviet captivity to return home years later. Exact numbers regarding how directly Morell's treatments influenced specific tactical judgments remain uncertain, and historians rightly caution against reducing complex military failures to pharmacology alone. Yet the timing of the most dependency-consistent period in Morell's records, beginning in 1943, does align closely with a documented shift in Hitler's decision-making style toward greater inflexibility and diminished tolerance for dissent among his commanders. Hitler's reliance on Morell's injections was not unique among wartime leaders in seeking chemical support under extraordinary pressure, though the scale and character of his regimen differed considerably from his counterparts. Winston Churchill relied on alcohol in the evenings and, according to some accounts, barbiturate sleeping aids during periods of acute strain, though nothing approaching the near-daily injection regimen documented in Morell's diaries. Wehrmacht soldiers more broadly were issued Pervitin tablets in vast quantities during the 1940 campaign in France, with millions of tablets distributed to sustain troops through days of continuous movement, a practice German military medical authorities later restricted as addiction and side effects became apparent among frontline units. Japanese kamikaze pilots were reportedly given methamphetamine-based stimulants before missions in the war's final years, intended to sharpen focus and suppress fear. Soviet forces relied heavily on rationed vodka to manage morale and cold under brutal winter conditions, a very different approach to chemical support entirely. What distinguished Hitler's case was not the use of stimulants during wartime, which was common across several armies, but the sheer duration, escalation, and medical complexity of a regimen administered continuously to a single head of state responsible for strategic decisions affecting the entire war, over a period stretching nearly 4 years, and increasingly combined with opioids and sedatives that would have impaired judgment in ways stimulants alone would not. The long-term historical significance of this episode extends well beyond the immediate battlefield decisions it may have influenced. Morell's meticulous, if erratic, medical records survived the war and were later recovered by American intelligence officers, providing historians with an unusually detailed window into the physical and psychological state of a wartime leader during his most consequential decisions, a level of documentation rarely available for other major historical figures of the period. The publication of Ohler's research renewed public and academic interest in the topic, though several historians, including Richard Evans, have cautioned that Ohler's conclusions sometimes overstate the direct causal link between specific drugs and specific decisions, arguing that Hitler's ideological rigidity, personality, and strategic misjudgments predated any pharmacological intervention and would likely have produced similarly catastrophic outcomes regardless. This ongoing historiographical debate illustrates a broader challenge in understanding leadership under extreme stress, namely, how difficult it remains to separate underlying temperament from chemically altered states when both point toward the same disastrous conclusions. Morell's original diaries and prescription records are preserved today in American and German archives, and portions have been digitized for historical research, offering scholars continued opportunity to reassess this evidence as medical understanding of these substances develops further. Return once more to that low, windowless room inside the wolf's lair on the morning Operation Barbarossa began, to Theodor Morell preparing his syringe in lamplight, while telephone lines carried news of an invasion already unfolding across a continent. That injection was never simply about a headache or a sleepless night, or the ordinary exhaustion of command. It was the opening note of a pattern that would deepen for nearly 4 more years, entangling a war of unprecedented scale with the private, increasingly dependent relationship between one physician and one patient, whose decisions would determine the fate of millions. The tanks rolling east that morning knew nothing of syringes or vitamin compounds. The soldiers freezing outside Moscow months later, and the men encircled at Stalingrad the following winter, could not have known that the man ordering them to hold their ground was, according to the physician's own records, receiving daily injections whose full effects even his own doctors did not fully understand. Historians will likely continue debating, for as long as this history is studied, precisely where illness ended and dependency began, and precisely how much of Germany's strategic rigidity during the war's final years can be traced to a syringe prepared each morning in a concrete bunker deep within a East Prussian forest. What the surviving records make clear beyond serious dispute is that the war's central strategic decisions were made by a man whose body and mind were, by 1943 and 1944, no longer entirely his own, sustained by an escalating chemical routine that promised clarity and delivered, in the end, only the illusion of it. The bells that did not ring an alarm on the 22nd of June 1941 would eventually ring in cities across a devastated continent, and somewhere behind that catastrophe, quietly, meticulously, and almost entirely unnoticed at the time, A doctor's syringe had already begun its long, corrosive work.